Hi, I'm Andrew Needle. I am a board certified civil trial lawyer in Miami, Florida. I've been practicing for too many years, over 40 years. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of uninsured and underinsured motorists coverage in your insurance policy. So if you reside in Florida, you're going to find out from this little talk today how important this coverage really is. Uh, for those who may not know, underinsured and uninsured motorist coverage is known as first party coverage. It's coverage that you yourself purchase from your automobile insurance company to protect you from an accident in which you're involved with either an uninsured motorist or an underinsured motorist. It also has the benefit of providing you with coverage in the event of a hit and run where there's a phantom vehicle that also falls under the category in most policies. As a matter of fact, I've never seen one without it, where the phantom vehicle, if reported timely, and where there's a police report, is entitled to activate the uninsured motorist coverage. We'll call it just coverage for short for purposes of today's talk. Now, this is coverage that you can find by statute in Florida statutes 627.727. It's been on the books for a very long time. In Florida, it is particularly important for a few reasons. Number one, Florida has a very high percentage of people who drive around in automobiles with no insurance at all. So that activates your uninsured motorist coverage in the event of an accident. Also, Florida requires very little in the way of bodily injury liability coverage by people who operate vehicles. Now, what that means is that's the coverage that if you're injured, that would be the coverage that the person who has injured you would have available to pay for your damages. In Florida, you can operate a vehicle without any bodily injury liability insurance, or you can operate it with limits as low as $10,000, depending on the circumstances. In any event, $10,000 in bodily injury liability insurance really doesn't go very far. As a matter of fact, if that's the only insurance in a case where you're severely injured, it's probably going to be economically unfeasible to even pursue that case. The costs of litigation and the other expenses that you're going to incur as far as hospitalization, doctor's bills, etc., are going to burn through that $10,000 in the blink of an eye. So what happens when you're in an accident and you're struck by somebody who has no insurance, meaning uninsured, or they're underinsured, carrying very little insurance? Well, under those circumstances, if you have uninsured motorist coverage, coverage, in your policy, then that coverage would pay you for injuries that are caused by the negligence of that person who struck and injured you. Now, this also would apply if you were a pedestrian. It would apply if you were a passenger in someone else's car. It would apply if you were on a bicycle. And these are all things that these are all accidents that occur quite frequently in Miami as people cross the street and drivers are paying attention to their phone or not paying attention to where they're going, and they strike you as a pedestrian. So this is very important coverage. Now, it's required to be offered with every insurance policy. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that the amount that has to be offered does not have to be more than what the bodily injury liability coverage is that you purchase. Most agents who are anxious to sell policies and most people who can't afford to pay high insurance rates will purchase minimum levels of their own bodily injury liability coverage so that the coverage that they might be offered will also be minimal. Now, that coverage also can be rejected entirely. And so you can wind up with a policy where you have no coverage at all. It's a bad situation, because if you're involved in an accident, you can't depend on the person striking you having a lot of insurance. In Florida, we've got a lot of rental cars. Rental cars are operated by tourists. Tourists don't carry their own insurance a lot of times. And by federal law, unfortunately, the liability of the rental car company is very limited. It's limited to only $10,000 under something called the Graves Amendment. And so if you're struck by a rental car and the driver doesn't have insurance, you're going to be in a world of trouble if you don't have any coverage. Now, of course, if you have health insurance, the health insurance would start to pay after your automobile benefits are exhausted, but it will not cover your pain and suffering, your disability, your inability to lead a normal life, and things like that. So your coverage is really critical. Now, you can purchase higher limits of coverage, but most insurance companies will not offer it. And it's also quite expensive. So because insurance in Florida generally is very high, the cost of insurance is very high. Most people, because they have other priorities in which they have to spend their money, housing, food, education expenses for children who might be in private schools, they don't allocate those funds to insurance, or at least automobile insurance. So you wind up driving around with very little coverage. But I can't emphasize enough that uninsured motorist coverage, coverage, is probably the most important coverage that you can have in your policy. And unfortunately, most people don't take advantage of it. Now, if you're struck by somebody who has low levels of bodily injury liability coverage, and your damages are in excess of what that coverage might be, your underinsured motorist coverage, which is your coverage, would activate, and you'd have coverage on top of what those low limits are. So you're basically putting your own coverage on top of that third party's coverage. That is the third party who was negligent and struck you. And so you're actually elevating the amount of coverage that might be available to you. If the case were to go to trial, then your carrier might be entitled to credit for any amount that was paid by the underinsured motorist, as a credit against the damages that a jury might assess. Now, we have situations often where you have an underinsured motorist carrier, that is the insurance company for the person who struck you, and you're involved in an accident, it's clear liability. Their insurance company comes in and they just give you that money. They tender the money to you. It could be $10,000 from many companies like Geico, Progressive, Allstate, State Farm. Many people drive around with minimum policies that are issued by those companies, who very often will just say, hey, here, take our money. Well, you can't just take their money if you have coverage. You have to first ask for the permission of your carrier to accept that money. And you then have to have the permission of your carrier to release the negligent party who struck you. If you do not have the permission of your own carrier to accept that money and give a release, then you're going to wind up losing your coverage, because that's a condition of the policy. Now, what happens if your carrier doesn't want to give their permission to accept that money? Well, under those circumstances, there's a 30-day window within which they have to make a decision to either allow you to take the money, or they have to pay you the amount that's been offered by the negligent party's insurance company, in which case your uninsured motorist company, your uninsured motorist carrier, your insurance company would retain the right to sue the person who struck you to try and get their money back that they're going to pay to you with the uninsured motorist coverage themselves. So that sums up the state of coverage in Florida. Every state's different. And if you're involved in an accident in another state and you have a Florida policy, generally your Florida policy is what's going to control. But don't sell yourself short. If you can afford it, coverage is probably the most important coverage that you can put into your automobile insurance policy. So I hope that you're going to get that coverage if you can afford it. And more importantly, I hope that you're never involved in an automobile accident where you need it. Thanks.